she wasn't around then. But a real venerable institution and an international institution of great repute. Tendai Biti, a long-time collaborator of the Foundation, a former human rights lawyer and a former Minister of Finance in the Government of National Unity in Zimbabwe. Ray Hartley, the Brenthurst Foundation's Director of Research. Mark Burke, who's the Member of Parliament in South Africa and also the opposition spokesperson on finance. Edwin Sifuna, a senator from Nairobi County, an opposition, the Secretary General of the opposition in Kenya. Matt Bryden, who will be known to many of you, who was a Canadian, is a Somalilander, maybe a little bit of a Kenyan, but he is a one-person international on our team. The Honourable Atupele Mulutsi, who's been a minister in Malawi in a variety of functions, who's a leader of the opposition and a presidential candidate in the upcoming election there. Diana Games, right at the back, who first visited Somaliland back in 2003. We were on the same visit together, and she's been coming back ever since. And like me, she will attest to the tremendous progress that you have made over the intervening 21 years. The country has, in more ways than one, come of age. Kate Almquist-Knopf, who was a senior administrator in USAID before becoming the head of the African Center for Strategic Studies at National Defense University in the United States, and is now a special advisor to the foundation, also based out of Kenya today. John Koorjoogayasha, who's been an election observer in Greece and who is a senior lawyer in Athens. Chilwe, who is a member of the ruling party and a parliamentary candidate, I believe, or nearly a parliamentary candidate in Zambia. And Tandele Maseko, who's a human rights leader in the Kingdom of Swaziland, also known as Eswatini. And it's a great pleasure to bring this group together with Richard Morrow, the person who's been keeping us all on time and in check over the last few days. I'm missing out somebody. Aziz, sorry. You see you weren't wearing your green shirt. This is why you should wear your green shirt. Aziz Amin, who was the Chief of Staff to President Ashraf Ghani in Afghanistan, and also very much involved with the Afghan electoral process, which I think would be fair to say is there are good things and bad things to be learned from. And that's often one of the strengths of our mission, is we not only look for best practice, but we look at worst practice, and we try and avoid the latter and accentuate the former. So with those brief words of introduction, this is a press briefing in 3 parts. If that was, well, 4 parts, if that was the first part. I'm now going to hand over to former Prime Minister Mokgweetsi Majoro to say a few words, then to Erastus Mwencha, and then I'm going to conclude with some of the more specific observations that we have made in our report, and we will make available the brief PowerPoint to you, should you so wish, at the end of this meeting. Over to you, Mokgweetsi.
Greg, thanks very much for your introductory remarks and recognizing us now to begin this press conference. Let me start off first by sharing with you that the Brenthurst Foundation mission here was a short one. We came in on the 9th, and this is the 15th today. By end of the night, we would have disappeared, but I'm happy that we will leave having formed some opinions about the elections, which we are going to share with you today. Let me start by thanking the people of the Republic of Somaliland for undertaking what I consider a credible election that you could see anywhere, conducting processes and procedures that are attuned to international best practice. I would like to, in particular, congratulate the government, President Musa, his government, and the NEC in particular for being resourced, for itself understanding and implementing what is otherwise a very difficult mandate of conducting a historical election, for preparing well, putting resources in place to ensure that the people of Somaliland would go to the polls, express their view, and the outcome would be considered acceptable. We understood that there were financial limitations, and in particular, the gap that had been closed previously by the European Union was not closed this time around, but the government stepped in to close that gap, I believe up to the tune of $10 to $11 million. And so this has, I believe, ensured the type of election that we witnessed. I would like to congratulate the civil society. I found them well organized. SONSAF, in particular, we met them on our first day here. They appeared ready. They were miffed a little bit by the fact that they did not have the resources required to deploy a fit-for-purpose mission because of funding reasons. They seemed ready. They were prepared to live with the resources that they have. They informed us that they would probably deploy half of what they wanted or would have liked to deploy. Nonetheless, they were committed to doing a good job within the limitations of their funding. I also want to congratulate the people of the Republic of Somaliland for recognizing the role, specifically for going out and having a special program to bring in as many women voters as could be possible. I understood first it was a policy decision by government, and then civil society entered the fray and assisted. So there was a specific project that was trying to bring in women into the polls. And we saw and recognized that there were many women that participated in this election. I feel privileged to have been part of this mission. Our mission, I've already indicated, was a short one. Nonetheless, as Greg has already indicated, it involved 20 individuals that are by themselves uniquely experienced in many different and diverse fields. They came from 12 different countries. We were all convened here in Hargeisa, and we were able to deploy the team in 4 regions: Hargeisa here, Borama, Burao, and Berbera. We were able to cover 635 polling stations in that one day. and that is equivalent to 24% of the stations on Wednesday. It is also equivalent to covering about 26% of their voting public. We're always concerned to not make conclusions based on flimsy and unrepresentative data. We try to cover the diversity of polling stations. I was in the Hageza team, but we were able to drive 45 minutes out of town to go and witness only 2 polling stations. But we thought it was worth it doing so because it gave us an understanding of a remote polling station. So we tried as much as possible to cover the diversity of polling stations in the Republic of Somaliland. Based on the reports that we received and our internal discussions, we concluded that the election was peaceful, it was fair, and it is credible. Peaceful, fair, and credible. There were incidents, but in our opinion, they were not sufficient to derail the will of the Somaliland people. On that basis, we are happy to share with you this message. As we leave Hageza, if we leave Somaliland today, we wish the people of Somaliland well in their next phase of a new government that they would have elected. Many of us in the team, at first we thought, yeah, okay, Somalia, Somaliland, same thing. That excludes Craig and Diana, those are locals here, and Matthew. And they understood the uniqueness of Somaliland and the rich history of Somaliland. But we were quick to learn. My first learning opportunity occurred at the airport when I was conversing with a former Minister of Foreign Affairs. She looked at me and she said, I know you. And I thought, yeah, I've been into so many places, you could know me. We started a conversation, and I made a mistake and said Somalia, and that ended the conversation. She corrected me very, very sharply. This is Somaliland, not Somalia. And that, the rich history of Somaliland, the aspirations that we see of the people of Somaliland have been touching to all of us. And in line with our long-held beliefs that people should chart their own destiny and futures, we wish the Republic of Somaliland well in its endeavors as it charts its way into the future. I thank you. I'll stop here with these a few remarks and invite my colleague to come in there.
For a very, my leaders has already said, very successful elections of what we witnessed 2 days ago. And proceed then to say that the biggest asset of Somaliland, apart from the resilient people, is your democracy, which is very well known in the region. And continue to plead that please guard this cherishly, this important asset, because it's what Gray calls, in a sea of troubled waters, we have a beacon of hope in Somaliland. And please continue to be that beacon of hope. Elections are never perfect. And the reason why observers come is not to come and ensure that that election goes well, is to observe what has gone on, and from that observation, indicate whether the elections as held during that time have been fair and free, which we have already concluded, but also make recommendations for future improvement. For us, having been here just this week, it may not be fair for us then to be here and pontificate on the entire election process, because election echo cycle is long. It starts from registration of voters, the campaign process, the resources that are made available for the Electoral Management Board, and then, of course, how electioneering is conducted, whether it is in an atmosphere that enables the various political parties to present their views to the people in order for the people to make a choice. And then, of course, the election day, which is largely what our observation is made of, and then what has gone on. And, of course, the day after. It is heartening to see. And, of course, the reports that we received, having met some of the political parties before the election day, to see nobody was complaining about the capacity of NEC to manage these elections. And indeed, we witnessed it. Of course, there were a few challenges, and those are some of the things that we make so that you can improve for the future. And so some of the recommendations which Gray will be presenting will go around the technology issues, support by international community, because this is one of the challenges Somalia has had, and also to be able to have robust registration that can mitigate against interference in the elections, of whatever nature, to ensure that you allow the elections to take place in an atmosphere that the people make a choice for themselves without undue influence. But also some recommendations on how you can also improve, particularly in the areas of after you have counted, how you could transmit this to the people. But overall, and so far, we are really encouraged to see the calmness, the enthusiasm. Being at the polling station was self-evident to see those people coming, some challenged physically, but wanting to make their voice heard. And to us, that's why we say, please guard this jealously. And therefore, it's now my honor again to ask Greg to summarize for us that report that he indicated. Thank you so much.
This is a presentation in 5 very brief parts. An overview of the mission, the pre-election engagements, a summary of election day activities, our observations, and then, critically, some recommendations for the future. I don't think it's very helpful for any election observation mission not to try and draw some conclusions to make the next process even better than the last one. I've already been through the observation mission. There's 20 of us. As the mission head said, we divided into 4 different areas: Baroma, Berbera, Barao, and Hargeisa. There were more in Hargeisa, of course. The teams of 4, which were further divided into teams of 2, went out to the other 3 centres, and the remainder stayed behind in Berbera. We met at the start with the National Election Commission after some initial briefings with experts in the area, including our in-house experts. We went to the briefing, as many of you did, in the other election monitoring teams, and then there were a whole bunch of questions, so we engaged further. And I have to commend the NEC commissioner or chairman who made time and what must have been an unbelievably compressed schedule to come and see us to answer the specific questions that we had. We also met with key political parties. One or two of them will recognize themselves here. The President, the USID Party, and of course Wadani. And as I said, we divided into these 4 teams, averaging 64 polling stations per 2-man or 2-person team. And the idea was we started off at one polling station before 7 o'clock in the morning, and then we went back there before closing to the same station and observed the counting process at that particular station. In total, there were 635 polling stations observed. We were busy, which is nearly 1/4 of all the polling stations across the country. And if you took the maximum but possible number of voters, it's over 300,000 voters. Of course, we don't know what the final number was of turnout, but I would suspect it's somewhere around about between 60 and 70% based on our own samples. We also tried during the course of the day to get a sense of how voting was going. So if you look at each polling station at the registration documents, you'll get the total number registered on the registration books, and we were able then, every time we visited, to be able to get a sense of how many people had voted because of the number of books that had been employed. And if I remember correctly, there were 50 sheets per book, and we were able to make a guesstimate calculation as to the turnout at that particular point over the course of the day. The key observations were that voting was peaceful, and that polling stations were well managed by the staff, and they were mostly university-age women, as we've already said. They opened on time with very few exceptions. There was some delay. One case in Barao, a book hadn't pitched up until 9 o'clock, for instance. But we didn't see anybody who was turned away. As a consequence of that, people waited out until there were any problems that had been resolved. And the presence of large numbers of women was very notable. I don't know whether there'll be those statistics released by the National Election Commission, but I wouldn't be surprised if the majority of voters were women, which says something particular about Somaliland's democracy in this respect. The voting procedures were adhered to with voter identification, the allocation of ballot papers and so on, and the voting in secret, with a few exceptions, and I'll come to that in a moment, and the use of indelible ink to mark voters. Where people couldn't vote or didn't understand what was required, that process was handled transparently. They announced who they were going to vote for. Of course, it didn't become secret then. And the party agent or the electoral official helped them at their request to put the cross in the right place. But this was in very much a minority of cases, and all of the election agents pronounced themselves happy with that process in every instance. The iris system was operational in the vast majority of the polling stations that we visited. As you know, there was a backup anyway in terms of the manual registration process, and in every case, both processes were used side by side. The use of the iris system made the manual process much quicker. We have some recommendations about how to improve this, which I'll come to in a moment. But it operated, it was patchy. In Barao, for instance, it was less than 10% of the 145 polling stations that we visited where the ISIS system didn't work, or the computer had failed, or they didn't talk to each other, whatever the question was. In other areas, that percentage was slightly less, but generally, I think in Berbera and Baroma, it was much the same. A few voters appeared to be younger than the minimum age of 15. I was a very young 15. I'm a very young 60, actually, now that I think of it. But they appeared on questioning to have the proper identification, although they looked pretty young for 15. And one has to, I think, have a slightly greater scrutiny of the voters' roll in the registration process in those instances. Some were placeholders in the queues for their parents or for others. That much was admitted. But certainly it was a concern that we saw expressed from all of our different centres. Voting was predominantly in the morning. There were big crowds in the morning in one or two places. I'll come back to this in a second. There was certainly a big crush, especially where there was a polling centre and there were more than one polling station inside. And by establishing a perimeter and by not managing outside the perimeter, there tended to be a big crush of people. This was noted in Hargeisa. It was noted also particularly in Berar, at the first polling centre station that we went to. And there was a huge crush of women outside. Use of the whip, or I don't know what they call it in Somaliland, a sort of stick, push people back. That's quite easy to remedy with better crowd control outside the perimeter. And then it was very quickly worked out that the way to do this was to actually divide people into lines outside and then allow them to filter in, and order was re-established. The closure of polling stations, in some cases, the counting started fairly quickly. People were tired. The polling officials were tired. The party agents were tired. But the polling was conducted openly, transparently. The counting was conducted openly and transparently, and with the party agents in agreement. I don't believe we saw a single instance of disagreements about results. There was some discussion and debate about where the X was made, whether there was smudging or not, but generally speaking, this process was handled very efficiently with the agreement of the party agents. Unused voting materials and other voting materials were correctly accounted for. I actually checked on this, where I asked the one polling centre or a station for unused ballot papers, because I wanted to keep them as a souvenir, and then they said, no, you can't do that because we have to account for them. It was very, very clearly adhered to in that regard. As I mentioned, we saw two notable security incidences, but the voting did continue, and they settled down at those two stations. The recommendations, the nub of this presentation. We would say that the independence and functions of the National Electoral Commission should be not only maintained, but should be strengthened. And as the head of our mission and as Mr. Mwensha have both said, Somaliland needs to be congratulated, and the NEC needs to be congratulated in particular for handling and running an election in a very poor country of a 650 GDP per capita economy. A lot of African countries will say that democracy is an expense that they can ill afford. I would argue that it's a cost, it's an expense that you can't not afford. You absolutely have to afford this, and Somaliland shows what's possible, even with a small budget and a relatively poor environment. And the NEC needs to be congratulated, as do the Somalilanders themselves, in the way in which this election was conducted, for the most part in good humour. There is a fundamental need to treat local and international observers the same, to treat them equally. There was some concern right at the outset that insiders were not going to be allowed to observe the counting process. That was soon clarified to in fact be the case. They were allowed to view the counting process, as indeed we were allowed to view the counting process. But these sorts of things, any sorts of confusion, should be clarified from the outset, and observers should be treated fairly and equally. we would stress the need for donor funding for local monitors in particular. We think it's exceptionally regrettable that some foreign donors withdrew support for the backbone of local observation efforts, and in so doing, wittingly or not, played into regional politicking. This is a Somaliland election. Regional politics should be put aside in that election process. And as both Mr. Mwensha and Prime Minister Majoro have indicated, Somaliland is an island of stability in a sea of great instability at the moment. And its election process and its democracy should be consolidated and indeed strengthened, and the donors have a meaningful role to play in this respect. They can also undermine it because of their, let's say, strategic interests playing differently. A thorough check on voter registration should be a matter of course, and particularly of the role and the need to eliminate any risk of underage voting, which, as I said, we were at times a little suspicious of. There needs to be a clear ban on party political politicking on election day. I know that lots of cameras are present when President Trump voted or anybody else votes in any election. That goes with the turf of politics, but actually turning this into a grandstanding event is something different. And I think the political parties need to rein in their own enthusiasm at times in the interests of democracy. I would argue for, and we would argue for, improved geolocation of polling centres, particularly as young people move increasingly to these devices running their lives, as they certainly appear to do for my children. And improved signposting will help for people like myself who don't have these things run their lives. And I think greater attention needs to be paid to the needs of voters with disabilities. We saw several instances of people in wheelchairs struggling their way to make their mark, and perhaps better identification at the outset. And I know the conditions in these polling stations is not easy, but great identification at the outset of those facilities with better access would be quite helpful for those with disabilities. We think that the IRIS system should be extended countrywide. It was a great asset. It helps to clear up any confusion. It worked remarkably well. I've observed elections in other places, in Kenya, for instance, and certainly the IRIS system here was as good as any that I've seen. And again, the way in which it was utilized, the reliability in the manner in which it operated were commendable. But it does require, and the laptop requires a long-term power system. And if there's no power available, then you need to use batteries, and those need to be made available at the very outset to ensure its full utilization. Crowd marshalling and control, I've already made a comment about, in the way in which this should be perhaps better organized and extended, avoiding the crushes at the entrances to polling centers. Transparency, we think, would be enhanced by the application of international best practice around the publication of results at the various polling centers. And that enables parallel voter tabulation to occur, which helps in the process of transparency and helps to monitor when the transmission phase begins and the votes get moved from one center to another. Critically, we believe, although there's legislation in this regard, that it's incumbent on the political parties to disclose their political funding bases. It's the norm in developed country democracies, including in South Africa. There's always controversy about whether this is fully applied to in South Africa, as you've probably seen, but it has become a matter of law and the matter of course that political parties adhere to this. The danger of not doing so is to allow yourself to be captured by particularly narrow external or internal economic or political interests. And even if that's not the case, you don't want that accusation out there. And the best way of dealing with that is to be transparent. You risk undermining your democracy if you don't apply that. That probably means giving some capabilities to either the NEC or government agencies or enforcing at least a spirit of collaboration by political parties in this regard. And you don't want to be the political party that wins and has this allegation lingering over you as a consequence. And then finally, greater effort should be made, and it's incumbent on all of us in this room, whether we're Somalilanders or not. Identity-based, clan-based, if I can term it that, if I'm South African, racially based or ethnically based politics, to issue-based politics. And there's a bunch of ways in which this can be achieved, not least through having presidential debates, to a proper interrogation of the manifestos of each of the parties. As Somaliland's democracy and its voting public matures, this is going to become the bread and butter around which choices are made. And political parties should recognize that and play to that great strength. Let me conclude by saying this list is not exhaustive, of course. We could have kept going, but we picked the 11 top issues that we thought should be highlighted, and that things that could be most easily attended to by Somaliland's political parties, that could be scrutinized by the voting public, by the electorate in Somaliland. And let me just say finally that it's a great pleasure and an honor to be witnessing Somalilanders make this competitive choice. As I said before, democracy is expensive, but it's a cost that's absolutely necessary, because it's only when you don't have it that you recognize the power of the asset that you possess. And it's not easy to create. It's not just a click of your fingers and you create a democratic process, institutions, but also a public that responds in the way that's intended. That takes many years to cultivate, many years to be rooted within your society. And Somaliland has that now after 9 competitive polls, and we look forward very much to being part of the 10th and the 11th and the 12th, and seeing this democracy develop as this, as I say again, island of stability in what resembles increasingly a sea of concern, let's say, kindly, in this region. So I think I have the support of the mission chair by saying congratulations to Somalilanders, congratulations on the way in which this election was run. It's a credit to yourselves and it's a credit to Africa. Thank you very much.
usoo wareegoo la jaanqaad dunida casriga oo ku maamula abka dahabalaas nolol maalmeedkaaga maaliyadeed. hadda kala soo deg App Store iyo Play Store abka dahabalaas.